The river had always been there for me, long before the board meetings and cement sidewalks, before the HOA newsletters, and petty infractions before the red-vested volunteers patrolled our cul-de-sac with clipboards and half-smiles. There was the river. My name is One Jackson Reed. I'm 58 years old, retired from the U.S. Geological Survey, after 3 decades in hydrology and terrain mapping. When I bought the property along the Lower Reading River 15 years ago, it wasn't because I wanted a fancy view or some status symbol. I chose this place because the river flowed clean, the willows whispered with the wind, and it reminded me of the places I used to survey when I was still chasing mud and fault lines across the Rockies. That river was my sanctuary. It ran behind my house just past the tree line, serene in summer, fierce in winter. I'd rise early, coffee in hand, and walk the gravel path I'd worn down with years of barefoot wandering. It wasn't just a patch of land. It was part of me. The soil beneath my boots, the silt patterns I could read like fingerprints, the soft hum of life pulsing through cattails and sedge. It grounded me in ways retirement never quite could. The neighborhood itself wasn't bad at first. Willowbrook Estates was quiet, middle to upper middle class. Neat lawns, well-behaved kids, retirees with model trains, and opinionated dogs. The HOA wasn't too overbearing back then. Mostly reminders about garbage bins and fence heights. I paid my dues, kept my property tidy, and waved when I had to. I didn't get involved. I wasn't here to make friends or enemies. I was here to listen to the river. But things changed. It started small. A new HOA president, Shelley Vance, elected 2 years ago with promises to revitalize and modernize the neighborhood. She had that voice, the overly cheerful one that hides condescension behind compliments. Shelley had no background in environmental science planning or even landscaping, but what she did have was ambition and a vision. She began pushing cosmetic projects to make the neighborhood more attractive to buyers. Decorative lighting, new signage, branded benches, a ridiculous proposal for synchronized sprinklers. But the one that made my skin go cold was her so-called Riverbank Restoration Initiative. I found out about it through a glossy mailer dropped at my door. HOA announces beautification plan for River Path. It screamed in royal blue fonts. Inside were mock-up images of trimmed banks, white stone paths, solar lights, and this was the worst part. A section labeled Controlled Sand Dredging for Aesthetic Smoothing. My heart dropped. Dredging, that was no small matter. Not in this region. Not with the river's slope gradient and sediment volatility. The Lower Reading was a dynamic system. Its banks evolved slowly, naturally, as all rivers do. You don't just smooth them for appearances. Not without permits. Not without assessments. And sure as hell, not without consequences. I walked to the back edge of my property where the HOA's proposed path was supposed to cut through. Red survey flags had already been staked. Spray-painted markings scarred the trees. The willow roots, the very roots that held the riverbank in place during spring floods, were targeted for removal. That evening, I attended my first HOA meeting in over a year. It was held in the community clubhouse, recently renovated with new marble floors that smelled like glue. Shelley stood at the podium like a queen addressing her court, flanked by 2 landscapers and a guy she introduced as the project consultant. When I raised my hand to ask if an environmental impact study had been done, Shelley blinked like I'd asked her in Latin. "It's just sand, Mr. Reed," she said with a smile. "We're not building the Hoover Dam." I asked if the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had been contacted since the Reading fed into a federally protected watershed 30 miles downstream. She waved it off. "We've already checked, it's fine," she said, not offering a single document to prove it. I knew it wasn't fine, and I knew she was lying. Over the next week, I went digging. Not with shovels, but maps, emails, digital archives, and old colleagues from my USGS days. I found a clause buried in a 1993 state-level hydrological agreement, a restriction on mechanical sand displacement within 500 feet of a residential zone due to risk of undermining the clay shelf beneath the riverbank. I printed it, highlighted it, and mailed it directly to the HOA office. No response. A week later, trucks showed up anyway. Big ones, backhoes, dredging rigs, dump trucks. Men in neon vests began carving into the bank like it was their personal sandbox. I stood there at the fence, watching as years of sediment stability were undone in hours. Willow trees ripped out, silt displaced, sandbags stacked recklessly along the edge where they had no business being. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the river at 2 a.m., flashlight in hand, documenting the destruction with my camera. The waterline had already shifted. The current, once gentle, now tore against the wounded shore like a dog gnawing at a broken leg. I sent the photos to the county. I called the Port State Environmental Compliance Division. I even wrote an op-ed for the local paper warning of erosion risk, collapse potential, and legal liability. And still the machines returned the next day. That's when I knew. This wasn't ignorance. This was arrogance. And it was going to cost them. It was just after dawn when the first vibrations hit my floorboards. At first I thought it might have been an earthquake, a minor tremor, maybe nothing out of the ordinary for a region with deep clay layers and shifting subsurface water flow. But then I felt the rhythm. The deep repetitive thumping that didn't rise and fall like tectonic movement, it pulsed, mechanical, predictable. I stepped onto my back porch, barefoot coffee mug in hand, and saw it a diesel excavator grinding down the slope at the edge of the riverbank, its treads leaving gouges in the wet soil. A line of dump trucks had formed along the utility access road engines, rumbling exhaust curling in the morning air like smoke from a coming war. No warning, no door knock, no notice, and not a single licensed agency on site. I threw on my boots, grabbed my folder, the one where I'd been keeping copies of the regulatory documents, old hydrological surveys, and photographic records, and made my way down the trail. As I got closer, the noise became deafening. A group of men, in safety vests, none with any recognizable agency patches, were shouting over the roar of machinery. One of them stood near the edge of the freshly torn embankment, pointing where the excavator should dig next. The willow grove was already half gone. The roots, now severed, lay exposed like veins. The silt beneath them, normally stabilized by decades of accumulated organic matter, had already begun to trickle down into the river. I recognized the man giving directions. Doug Pearson, local landscaping contractor barely certified whose business had boomed after Shelley Vance became HOA president. He wasn't an environmental engineer. He wasn't a hydrologist. Hell, I'd seen the man fail to properly install a French drain on a neighbor's yard 2 years back, which resulted in a flooded garage. I walked up to him, clipboard in hand, my voice raised above the noise. "Doug, who approved this?" He turned surprised to see me, then offered a condescending grin that made my fists clench. "Jackson, we're just cleaning it up. HOA's orders. Looks better already, doesn't it? Did you pull permits from the city, from the county? Did you get an environmental assessment?" He shrugged. "It's private land. HOA's jurisdiction. Beautification project." My jaw tensed. "You're dredging sand from a live river. That makes it a protected waterway. You're operating heavy equipment within the riparian buffer zone. That's a violation of state law." He blinked at me unmoved. "I don't deal with the legal stuff. Shelley handles that. I just do the work." Behind him, I saw the bucket of the excavator scoop another massive load of riverbank sand and dump it onto a truck bed. The soil tumbled like dry snow, but I could see the gray-blue smear beneath it, the clay shelf. They were breaching the river's structural support layer. I didn't argue. I pulled out my phone and started filming. I walked the perimeter, narrating everything: the equipment being used, the lack of silt fencing, the absence of erosion control, the proximity to residential structures. I got footage of the trucks, the tree stumps, the eroded shore. I took time-stamped photos of the excavator arm slicing through the bank like it was paper. An hour later, I uploaded everything to the online complaint portal of the HOA California Water Resources Control Board. Then I called my contact at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a friend of mine, Sarah Clifton. Still worked regulatory over Section 404 compliance. She picked up on the second ring. "Jackson," she asked, her voice groggy. "It's not even 8 a.m. I need you to listen carefully," I said. Willowbrook HOA is illegally dredging sand from the lower Redding. There's active erosion, unauthorized equipment, and they're breaching the lower clay line. I sent you a folder, check your email. There was silence on the other end for a beat. "Then you've got to be kidding me." "I wish I were," she sighed. "Okay, I'll flag it to regional. But if they didn't get a 404 permit, and if they're within the regulated water body limits, they're screwed." That gave me some comfort, but not enough. Because as I stood there watching the HOA's workers desecrate the riverbank, I noticed something else. They weren't just removing sand. They were stockpiling it. 3 dump trucks had already been filled and parked across the main road behind the clubhouse. Workers were laying tarps across the loads like they intended to use the material elsewhere. I overheard one of the crew talking about regrouting the trails and filling the low patch near the tennis courts. They weren't even planning to dispose of it properly. They were going to repurpose it within the neighborhood. Unfiltered, unstabilized. This wasn't beautification, it was pillage. Later that afternoon, I marched straight into the HOA office. Shelley was there, seated behind a wide desk, cluttered with color-coded folders and scented candles. She looked up at me with the kind of smile you reserve for rude customers at a spa. "Jackson," she said too pleasantly, "what brings you by?" "You know what brings me by." She raised an eyebrow. "If this is about the river project, we already sent out flyers." "No, Shelley, you didn't. And even if you had, you're violating state and federal law. You're dredging without permits. You're destabilizing the entire bank. You're risking property damage and environmental collapse." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Mr. Reed, I appreciate your concern. But the HOA board voted unanimously to approve the project. Our consultant assured us it's within code. Then show me the permits. They're being processed." I stepped forward. "That's not how it works. You don't dredge first and then ask for permission. That's how you get fined into bankruptcy." For a flicker of a second, I saw something flash across her face. Fear, guilt. It was gone before I could name it. She stood smoothing down her blouse. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed. Unless you're filing an official appeal with the board, I'll have to ask you to leave." So I did, but not before I said you'll regret ignoring the river. It remembers what you take. That night, the sky opened up. Rain lashed the trees, thunder cracked above the valley, and the water line began to rise, fast. I stood by the glass doors at the back of my house, watching the current grow stronger, the bank sag, lower, the dredged scars darken under the storm. I knew what was coming, and I knew they had no idea what they'd unleashed. By morning, the river was unrecognizable. What had once been a controlled current guided by vegetation and silt contour had turned violent and swollen. It rushed along the banks like a beast unchained, surging higher with every passing hour. The heavy rainfall from the night before had pushed the limits, but it wasn't just the storm that made the river rise with such fury. It was the absence of restraint. They had stripped it bare. The sand they'd taken had once weighted the river's curves, slowed its turns, absorbed the panic of storms like this one. The roots of the willows they'd hacked out had held back centuries of erosion. Now, with all that gone, the river behaved like a creature betrayed. It lashed out. I'd been up most of the night monitoring it. I had set up trail cameras along my stretch of the bank, logging time-lapse footage, capturing the moment the water began licking at the base of the slope where my backyard started. By 7 a.m., I could already see minor collapses happening downstream. Nothing catastrophic yet, but unmistakable signs of undercutting. The water was slicing into the raw edge like a scalpel. I didn't wait for another polite HOA meeting. Instead, I composed a formal incident report and delivered printed copies to the HOA office, the City Environmental Department, and the County Floodplain Management Division. I didn't care anymore if I came across as paranoid or difficult. I included every image, every timestamp, and a copy of the state regulation they were in violation of. By noon, I went back to the clubhouse for the monthly HOA gathering, this time with a purpose. The storm had tapered into a drizzle, but the ground was sodden, and the air was heavy with that post-rain smell of earth and tension. The meeting room was filled with the usual mix of apathy and condescension. Folding chairs, store-bought cookies, and Shelley Vance standing at the front in her signature crimson blazer. I sat in the back at first, watching as she clicked through a slideshow about new fencing policies and updated trash bin locations like nothing was happening outside. Then she got to the beautification update. "We've successfully completed the first phase of our riverbank improvements." She beamed as if she hadn't presided over the slow destruction of an ecosystem. "Thanks to Doug Pearson's team, we removed over 40 tons of unsightly material and have plans to widen the trail in the next few weeks." Unsightly material. She meant the riverbank. She meant my home's foundation. I raised my hand, standing without waiting to be called on. "Excuse me," I said. "You might want to put those widening plans on hold, because the section of river you just dredged is about 12 hours away from total failure." The room fell silent. Shelley's face barely changed. "Mr. Reed," she said evenly, "we've already addressed your concerns. The board has reviewed your documents, and we stand by our contractor's assessment." "You mean the guy who couldn't pass a class in watershed dynamics, the one who's operating heavy machinery in a legally protected riparian corridor?" I didn't care anymore if I sounded aggressive. This wasn't about neighbors and politics anymore. It was about physics, gravity, water, and time. I stepped to the front, opened my folder, and spread out 4 printed images on the projector table photos from my trail cams. They showed the same spot on the river taken 12 hours apart. In the first photo, the bank was whole. In the second, the earth had slumped a 6-foot section, gone swallowed by the river's deepening channel. "This isn't a prediction," I said. "This is happening now." Shelley didn't even look at the photos. "If this is another scare tactic." "It's not," I snapped. "This is empirical data. Your so-called improvements have destabilized the clay shelf under this neighborhood. I can name 10 houses that are now at risk, mine included. And when one of those yards collapses into the river, it's not going to be me footing the bill. It'll be you." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. One woman, Denise, who lived further upstream, raised her hand. "Wait, are you saying the river's going to take our yards? If the bank gives way, and it's showing signs already, yes. And your HOA insurance won't cover it if it's the result of unpermitted illegal activity." That got their attention. Shelley looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon. "We have documentation. We checked with who? Show us the permit, the hydrology study, anything." She froze, because she had nothing, because I knew she had nothing. "I've already sent a formal complaint to the state," I continued. "The county floodplain manager is reviewing it. And if the Corps confirms the river qualifies as jurisdictional under the Watch Clean Water Act, this whole board is liable for enforcement penalties." There it was, fear. A board member stood up. "Shelley, is this true? Did we bypass permits?" Shelley's voice faltered. It was just sand. Just sand. Like bones are just calcium." A ripple of murmuring began across the room. Some were skeptical, but others were alarmed. I saw it in their faces. Neighbors who'd once smiled politely at me at the mailbox now looked uneasy, glancing toward the windows as if they could see the river swelling just beyond the trees. But then someone laughed. Doug Pearson, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed and smug. "You guys gonna believe the doomsday guy with the camera," he said. "It's a river. Banks erode. They always have. Jackson's just mad we didn't hire him to lecture us about dirt." The tension in the room broke into a scattered chuckle from the more loyal HOA members. Shelley exhaled relieved, grabbing onto Doug's dismissal like a life raft. I gathered my papers, chest tight with fury and disbelief. "Laugh all you want," I said, walking toward the exit. "But rivers don't listen to bylaws. And when it comes for your yards, I won't say I told you so." I stepped outside into the misty air. The river was louder than usual, as if it too was growing tired of being ignored. I stood for a long time on the back trail that night, rain jacket zipped, tight flashlight in hand, watching the river surge below. The slope behind my house was beginning to soften. The roots were exposed in places they never should have been. I placed stakes in the ground, marking the retreating line of safety. And then I waited, because science doesn't require belief. It simply happens. 3 days, that's all it took. In just 72 hours after I was publicly laughed out of the clubhouse, the river took what it wanted. It began subtly, almost silently. The kind of change most people wouldn't notice if they weren't looking, unless they had trained eyes like mine. At first, it was just the way the slope looked slightly steeper, the way the water line edged closer after each rain. Then the cracks started. Hairline fractures at first creeping along the rear edges of the properties downstream. Mostly cosmetic at that point. Superficial damage, what the HOA would probably call settling. But I knew better. When I first entered the field of hydrology, I had been trained to see terrain as something alive, shifting constantly under the pressure of water roots and time. A river doesn't just erode, it studies its surroundings. It probes weakness like a tongue pressing against a loose tooth. And when the balance is broken, it doesn't ask questions. It takes. The sand, of course, was the linchpin. That dredged material had once acted like ballast. It had compressed over time under its own weight, slowing the subsurface seepage of water and allowing vegetation to bind the surface. Without it, the entire shelf had been left hollow, undermined. The water had new paths, now uncontrolled ones. By the fifth day, 2 backyards had slumped visibly. Neighbors who had once waved at me politely from across the walking path now hovered nervously near yellow tape and orange cones hastily dropped by county workers. They still weren't admitting it publicly, not yet, but the HOA had started quietly fielding calls from frantic homeowners. Contractors had been seen on properties measuring slope angles and surveying drainage lines. One neighbor, the Mendozas, had backed their patio furniture all the way against their sliding glass doors. The river had begun to eat. I stayed mostly silent through it. I wasn't there to gloat. I had warned them. I spent my time mapping it all. I walked the stretch of bank every morning, with my surveyor's wheel noting changes in elevation, tracking new slides and cracks. I flagged trees that had begun to tilt, some leaning so precariously they looked like they might topple with a gust of wind. One morning, I found a section of the path behind the tennis courts completely sheared. The asphalt had fractured and one side had sagged a full 8 inches. Beneath it, the soil had dissolved, leaving a cavernous gap beneath what was supposed to be stable ground. I photographed everything. On the 6th night, a storm rolled in. A slow, heavy system that dropped 2 inches of rain in just a few hours. That was all the river needed. At 3:12 a.m., the banks behind Shulot 47 gave out. I didn't see it firsthand, but I heard it. A thundering crack followed by a low, drawn-out rumble that felt like it came from the earth itself. I jumped from my bed, heart pounding, and ran to the back deck. Through the rain and dim security light, I saw the outline of a retaining wall collapsing in the dark chunks of stone and soil disappearing into the roiling water below. By morning, word had spread. The residents of Lot 47, John and Mira Daniels, had been awakened by their dog barking only to discover that 15 feet of their backyard had vanished. Their deck now hung awkwardly in midair, barely connected to the house. The river had sliced into the clay shelf beneath them like a surgeon's scalpel. The HOA called it an act of God, but I knew better, and so did the Daniels. I got a call from John that afternoon. His voice was shaking. "You were right," he said. "They said it was natural. But it's not. You warned them." I offered him everything I had, my photos, my terrain logs, the hydrology reports, the historical surveys from my USGS days. He took them all. I told him to start by calling his insurance, then to contact the City Code Enforcement Office. Then I told him about my conversation with the Corps of Engineers and the complaint filed with the state. "They're coming," I said, "sooner than later." Shelley, meanwhile, stayed silent. The HOA newsletter didn't mention the collapse. No email went out. No public statement. But something had shifted. Neighbors were no longer looking at me with suspicion or derision. Now they looked at me with something closer to fear, some with quiet apology in their eyes. They saw the flags I had placed along the retreating edge. They saw the way I walked the perimeter with purpose. Some began to follow behind me, asking questions. "Is my yard safe? How far could this go? What can we do now?" I answered honestly. Some homes were likely fine further from the water's edge on reinforced ground, but the ones closest to the dredged section, they were on borrowed time. The silt barrier was gone. The clay was exposed, and the river had learned how to dig. One woman broke down crying on my driveway. "We just moved here last year," she whispered, hugging herself. "We didn't know. We thought it looked so pretty." I couldn't even be angry anymore. The damage wasn't hers to bear. The following morning, Shelley reappeared. She came to my house unannounced, clipboard in hand. Her red HOA jacket looked ridiculous against the gray clouds and wet wind. She was alone, no board members. She stood on my porch like a student sent to apologize for something she didn't understand. "We need your help," she said flatly. I stared at her. I asked. "Or you?" Her jaw tightened. "The board would like to retain you as a consultant. Just until this is resolved. We know you have a background." I laughed, not out of joy, not even mockery, but something darker. Exhaustion, disbelief. "You didn't care about my background when you were ripping out the riverbank. You dismissed every warning I gave. You called me paranoid." She flinched but held her ground. I was wrong. Those 3 words should have meant something, but they came too late. I didn't invite her inside. I didn't offer her coffee. I handed her a sealed envelope, instead copies of the formal letters I'd sent to the EPA and the State Water Board. "They're coming," I said again. "And they won't be hiring me." She took the envelope, eyes wide now. You went federal. No, I said. The river did. That night, 2 more trees fell into the current. By week's end, the first federal investigators arrived with cameras, clipboards, and somber eyes. It started like any other rainy night, quiet, slow, unassuming. A drizzle coated the neighborhood by dusk, wrapping the street in a blanket of mist. I made tea, reviewed the latest erosion log I'd compiled, and sent another set of flagged images to the State Water Engineer's office. I was preparing for bed when the wind picked up and the sky gave way to something darker. The storm didn't roar. It settled, like a weight on our roofs. Heavy, steady rain, no lightning, no theatrics, just a constant, determined downpour that would last 6 straight hours. I went to bed, but didn't sleep. My body couldn't let me. I had lived with rivers long enough to know that when clay gets soaked beyond threshold, it stops resisting. And when it stops resisting, the earth begins to move. At 2:43 a.m., I was at my desk staring at the screensaver on my laptop when the power cut. A flicker, a pause, and then darkness. Then the sound came. It didn't sound like destruction at first. It was a dull, cracking snap, followed by a low-pitched groan like wood splintering under pressure. I stood frozen. The sound grew louder, deeper, like the ground itself was stretching. Then came the roar. A sudden violent collapse, earth ripping from earth. Windows trembled. The floor shifted beneath me, just enough to steal balance. A burst of air hit the side of my house like a shockwave. I ran to the sliding doors at the back, flashlight in hand, heart-pounding pulse in my ears. I wasn't ready for what I saw. The backyard of Lot 45, 2 doors down, was gone. Not partially eroded, not sagging. Gone. The entire yard had collapsed into the river, taking with it the fence, a row of rose bushes, and half the wooden deck. I saw a grill bobbing like a piece of trash in the water. The river had widened by almost 8 feet in that single motion, and it hadn't stopped. The bank behind the clubhouse where the dredging had begun was actively giving way, chunks of mud and stone falling in rhythmic spasms pulled down by the current. What remained of the sandpath was crumbling with each passing second, falling in sheets of soaked soil. I grabbed my camera, my waterproof jacket, and ran outside. By the time I reached the trail, half the bank had surrendered. A chorus of alarms began sounding, motion sensors, yard security systems, someone's car horn screaming into the dark like a banshee. Lights flicked on across the neighborhood one by one as neighbors rushed to windows or emerged onto porches wrapped in bathrobes and panic. The HOA clubhouse itself, built barely 6 years ago, was now in the danger zone. Its foundation, once perched safely behind a slope, now sat barely 20 feet from the edge. The land that had supported it was gone. Water tore through its base, hungry and relentless. I saw Shelley. She was standing outside the clubhouse in a raincoat, hands trembling, mouth open. She turned and locked eyes with me as I approached. "What do we do?" she screamed through the rain. It was the first time I'd ever seen her afraid. Not performative fear, real fear, the kind that rattles bones. "You evacuate," I shouted back. "Now, before someone dies." Her radio crackled. A voice, Doug's, cut through the static. "Shelley, part of the trail's in the river. You need to get out of there." She turned and ran. Sirens began wailing in the distance, city responders finally catching up to the magnitude of what was happening. I met the Daniels and the Mendozas on the street, ushering them to the higher cul-de-sac behind the neighborhood. I knocked on doors, banged on windows, urged people to move uphill, to leave behind their backyards and possessions. It wasn't just property at stake anymore. It was lives. An hour later at first light, the devastation came into full view. Half the riverbank between shoal lots 42 and 48 had caved in. Trees lay horizontal, root balls exposed to the sky. Fencing, patio furniture, even a swing set had disappeared. The walking trail was no more, it had been shredded and swallowed. The HOA's decorative solar lights floated downstream like ghostly buoys. The clubhouse had partially collapsed. Its rear wall was gone, torn open like paper. Mud and water had filled the back rooms. The new fitness center was flooded, its machines tilted like broken bones. The front half of the building still stood somehow, but its concrete pad had cracked, and it leaned ominously toward the river's open mouth. Reporters arrived by noon. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage of the disaster. People stood in clusters, wrapped in blankets, whispering and weeping. City engineers cordoned off the lower blocks, declaring several homes unsafe for re-entry. County officials arrived with hazard placards and emergency notices. An officer handed Shelley a document marked Mandatory Abatement Order. Her face turned chalk white. And then came the state officials. Sarah Clifton, my old colleague from the Corps of Engineers, stepped out of a black SUV with the seal of the U.S. Army emblazoned on the door. She had brought 3 agents, a geotechnical analyst, and a floodplain response specialist. She found me near the trailhead. "You weren't kidding," she murmured, surveying the wreckage. "No," I said, "and this is only what you can see." She nodded grimly. "We pulled the satellite soil overlays. The base integrity is compromised all the way down to the old creek fork. There's a high risk of progressive failure along the northern bend. The HOA may have triggered a landslide waiting to happen." I led her along the upper trail, pointing out where the dredging had begun, where the machinery had operated without permit, where the bank had been cut unnaturally straight, a textbook error in soil retention. Sarah took photos, took notes, and asked pointed questions. Then she said, "Do you know if they repurposed any of the dredged material?" I nodded. "It's sitting under the tennis courts. Used it to level a low patch." I told them it wasn't stabilized. She exhaled. "It's going to liquefy." We both looked out across the clubhouse. The broken trees, the river still rising. I heard someone sobbing in the distance. Sarah turned to me. "They'll try to shift blame. Say they didn't know, that the contractor misled them." I shrugged. "Let them try." I documented everything. Every meeting, every flag, every unanswered warning. She smiled just slightly. "Then it's time." I watched as she and her team began measuring, photographing, asking questions. I watched as Shelley tried to maintain composure in front of the cameras, only to break down when the environmental violations were read aloud. I watched as the board members scattered like frightened birds, suddenly unsure of the roles they had signed up for. It all happened overnight. The collapse of the land. The collapse of their pride. The collapse of a structure they built on arrogance instead of understanding. And now the river had begun its work of reminding them all, you cannot bend nature to your will without consequence. By the end of the week, national media had picked up the story. "Aesthetic landscaping, gone wrong, leads to riverbank collapse," the headlines read. "Luxury HOA faces environmental disaster after illegal dredging." The drone footage made its way onto late-night television panoramic shots of the broken riverbank, the collapsed clubhouse, and the dangling backyards of homes once deemed executive lots. A viral TikTok video showed a patio table slowly sliding into the muddy river, the soundtrack overdubbed with circus music. I wish I could say I took pleasure in it. I didn't, because even as the media painted HOA leaders like cartoon villains, the truth was uglier and more mundane. The people suffering the most weren't Shelley or Doug or the smug board members who'd ignored science, they were the families. Now displaced, the retirees with cracked foundations, the single mom on Lot 49, who cried when she learned her homeowner's insurance wouldn't cover damage from unpermitted HOA construction. And that's when the screaming started. Not literal at first, though that would come. No, first, it was in the form of emails, carefully worded blame-shifting missiles. The first came from Shelley, a mass message titled, "Community Update and Clarification." It began with a lie. "Dear residents, in light of recent events, we wish to clarify that the HOA board acted in good faith with the guidance of hired professionals. We understand concerns have been raised and damage has occurred, but we want to reassure you that no residents were ever put in danger intentionally. Unfortunately, misinformation spread by certain individuals created confusion and unrest. While we respect all voices in our community, it's crucial to rely on trusted sources during emergencies." Certain individuals. I knew exactly who she meant. 2 hours later, Doug went on a local radio show. The host asked him how the HOA could have miscalculated so badly. Doug laughed. "Look, I'm just the contractor," he said, voice smug. "We were hired to do a job, and we followed what the HOA approved. As for that Jackson guy, he was always a little intense. I think he just wanted to be in charge." I sat at my kitchen table listening, heart thudding, jaw locked. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But I also could. Because this is what people like Shelley and Doug do. They rewrite the narrative while the dust is still settling before people realize they're breathing in the collapse. I could have gone on a public counterattack. I could have posted all my records, started a YouTube channel called In My Journalist Friends, but I didn't, not yet. Instead, I kept documenting. I met with 3 displaced families, personally helping them prepare their statements for the upcoming state review. I created a folder they could submit to insurance adjusters and FEMA, containing photos, measurements, and documentation of how the dredging had violated state code. I walked the slope every morning, checking for new shifts, marking tree tilts, mapping flow changes. But the HOA wasn't done. 2 days after the radio show, I got served a formal cease and desist order signed by the HOA board's legal counsel, accusing me of spreading false and defamatory claims, inciting panic among residents, and creating obstruction during emergency remediation. I held the letter in my hand, dumbfounded. Then I laughed out loud. They were trying to silence me. They'd destroyed the riverbank, nearly killed a dozen families' home equity, and now they wanted to erase the one person who had seen it coming. I called their lawyer. His name was Greg Holloway. He had a voice like a customer service robot, and the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong because he'd never dared anything risky. "Mr. Reed," he began, "we understand you have concerns, but these public accusations, I have documentation, 74 photographs, 21 time-stamped videos, and scanned permits, or rather, lack thereof, which prove the HOA acted unlawfully." He went silent. "I also have the emails your president sent confirming the contractor had begun work prior to receiving environmental clearance. Would you like those included in my deposition?" Another pause. "You intend to sue?" he asked. "No," I said. "I intend to protect my neighbors. I intend to make sure this never happens again. And if that means your board faces a class action lawsuit or loses its charter, so be it." 2 days later, the cease and desist was rescinded, but the damage was done. Not just to the homes or the river, but to the truth. Shelley, in a last-ditch effort to save face, organized a town hall meeting at the partially salvaged clubhouse, complete with coffee pastries and a guest facilitator flown in from some conflict resolution nonprofit. I wasn't planning to attend, until I found out they'd used my name again in print this time. The meeting flyer read, "Join us as we address the misinformation and ongoing disruptions caused by Mr. Jackson Reed." That was it. I showed up early. The room was packed. Some neighbors sat stiffly with folded arms. Others looked at me with shame in their eyes, regret twisting their faces. I didn't wait for permission this time. I walked to the front, dropped a stack of folders on the table, and addressed the room. I was labeled a disruptor. I began for doing what this HOA refused to, telling the truth. No one interrupted me. "You want to talk about misinformation? Let's talk about the claims made by your board, about the so-called beautification plan that violated 4 state ordinances, about the contractors hired without proper credentials, about the dredging that destabilized the bank and put dozens of lives at risk, about the clubhouse behind me, which is now on the verge of red tagging because they used illegally extracted river sand to level the soil beneath it." I held up a document. This is from the HOA State Water Resources Control Board. It verifies that no permits were granted for any river work at Willowbrook Estates. None. I let it hang in the air. Then I turned to Shelley. "I tried warning you. I sent letters. I showed data. I begged you to stop. You mocked me. You said I was dramatic." I turned back to the crowd. And now 3 homes condemned. 1 clubhouse half collapsed. 40 residents displaced. Property values plummeting. And the river, once our greatest asset, turned into a threat. There was a long silence. Then Denise from upstream stood up. I believe him. One by one, others rose. Not everyone, but enough. Shelley said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. That night, I went home and found an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a handwritten note. "You were right. I'm sorry I didn't listen. Mira." I sat on the porch in the fading light, listening to the river. It had calmed after the storm. Its voice was slower now, less urgent, but it was still there, steady, relentless, alive. And so was I. After the town hall, the silence from the HOA board was deafening. No rebuttal, no follow-up statement, no denial, not even a half-hearted PR spin. The clubhouse remained locked down, with bright orange fencing warning of unstable ground, and most board members stopped showing their faces in public. Shelley's SUV, once parked proudly in front of her corner lot, had vanished. Word had it she was working remotely from her sister's house in Sacramento. But I didn't let up, because I knew what was coming next, the phase they never warn you about, the cover-up. I had seen it before during my years at USGS. Organizations that make dangerous mistakes always follow the same pattern: deny, distract, discredit, and finally, disappear the evidence. Except this time I had the receipts, all of them. I kept them locked in a fireproof box in my study. I'd built the file meticulously over the course of months, not just out of paranoia, but out of the instinct drilled into me after 3 decades working with bureaucrats who loved plausible deniability. I had hard copies of every HOA notice, including the ones with no letterhead slipped anonymously into mailboxes to inform residents of river beautification. I had printed emails, many obtained through open record requests I'd filed when I suspected that HOA funds had been spent on unlicensed contractors. I even had surveillance footage from my trail cams showing dates, times, and vehicle plates of every truck that dumped dredged material near the tennis courts. The star of my evidence, however, was a 3-minute video. I had captured it on a clear Tuesday afternoon, 5 weeks before the collapse, when the excavation was in full swing. Doug Pearson, standing in a neon vest at the river's edge, pointed to the excavator operator and barked, "Take out that whole section, we're going to need that fill for the rec center lot." The operator asked if it was cleared. Doug laughed. "Permits schmermits, HOA owns this land." That video was now stored on 3 encrypted hard drives, uploaded to a private cloud, and backed up in a safety deposit box under my niece's name. So when the city inspector finally mobilized after the state pressure kicked in, showed up at my door asking for a complete timeline, I didn't hesitate. I handed him 2 binders, one labeled hydrological evidence, the other HOA correspondence. His eyebrows lifted as he flipped through the documents. "You've been thorough." "I've been patient," I corrected. He looked over his glasses. "You understand this could become a criminal inquiry, right?" "I do. I also understand that if you don't act quickly, someone's going to move a bulldozer in the middle of the night and claim the whole thing never happened." He nodded, took the binders, and promised to file the evidence with both the city attorney's office and the State Oversight Committee by end of day. That was a Friday. By Monday, subpoenas were issued. City Code Enforcement raided the HOA office, an act I never thought I'd live to see. 2 agents hauled out boxes of paperwork, computer towers, and USB drives. Doug's truck was impounded. Shelley was summoned to testify before the City Council's Environmental Board. The sight of her walking up the courthouse steps, shoulders hunched, sunglasses too large, told me all I needed to know. She never thought it would go this far. But it had, and I was far from done. I attended that council hearing not to gloat, but to bear witness. I wore a simple gray button-down, the same kind I used to wear on field inspections, and brought my own notepad. Shelley sat at the table with her attorney, pale and visibly shaken. The council members weren't friendly. Councilman Baker, a former environmental attorney, led the charge. "Mrs. Vance," he began, "are you aware that your HOA was operating heavy machinery in a protected water corridor without appropriate local or state permits?" I was told the contractor had checked all that. She murmured. "And yet, no documentation exists. Furthermore, we have emails from you dated 6 weeks prior indicating you instructed the contractor to proceed regardless of pending applications. Do you deny writing that?" Her lawyer leaned in and whispered. "I don't recall," she said softly. I handed the clerk a copy of my own. "Councilman," I stood, "if I may submit a copy of the email with full headers and timestamps. It came from Mrs. Vance's HOA email account and was CC'd to 3 other board members." He accepted it, nodding. "So noted." Shelley didn't look at me, but her lawyer did, and I saw the blood drain from his face. Over the next 2 hours, the council outlined a damning case: the HOA's illegal dredging, misuse of neighborhood funds, bypassing of permitting processes, and falsified statements to the city regarding environmental impact. The cherry on top came from an EPA representative who'd flown in from San Francisco. "Initial soil samples from the tennis courts confirm unregulated fill," she stated plainly. "The material is unstable, likely contaminated from riverbed runoff, and in violation of Section 302 of the Clean Water Act." By the end of the hearing, the council voted unanimously to freeze all HOA discretionary powers and place the association under emergency oversight by a third-party management firm. Shelley resigned the next morning. Doug vanished. Rumors spread that he'd taken a temporary gig 3 towns over doing driveway paving. He left behind unpaid invoices and an HOA contractor badge that had been yanked out of his truck console and dropped on someone's lawn like an afterthought. The board, now fractured and disgraced, was left scrambling. A handful of remaining members tried to apologize in private. Denise sent me a card with a gift basket of teas and a note that read, "You saved us. I'm sorry it took disaster for us to see it." I didn't need the tea, but I kept the note. And the receipts I sent those neatly scanned and indexed to every homeowner whose property had suffered damage. I offered to testify on their behalf. I even sat with the Mendozas and the Daniels as they began drafting their civil claims. By now, more than half the neighborhood had formed a legal coalition to seek damages. The river still flowed steady but scarred. Some mornings, I would sit on the ridge overlooking the spot where the clubhouse once stood proudly. Now it was a shell half demolished, its remains fenced off, a warning of what arrogance does when it pretends to know more than the earth. But not all was lost. The state, in coordination with the EPA and the city, announced a recovery plan, full ecological restoration of the lower Reading riverbank. Native willows would be replanted. The path would be regraded using bioengineering methods. The clay shelf would be stabilized with geogrid materials. And I, after so many months of being dismissed, was asked to oversee it as a volunteer technical advisor. I said yes, because I wasn't doing this for revenge anymore. I was doing it for the river. And the people finally ready to listen. They arrived in black SUVs at 9:03 a.m. sharp. 6 men and women in federal windbreakers, some with EPA insignias, others from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The lead investigator, a tall, meticulous woman named Erica Lowe, stepped out first. I recognized the name. She'd co-authored a paper in the Journal of Urban Hydrology about sediment displacement and floodplain destabilization. A professional and far from the type to be charmed or intimidated by suburban politicking. I met them at the trailhead. Erica extended a gloved hand. "Mr. Reed, we appreciate your cooperation." "You brought the right people," I said, motioning toward the battered riverbank behind me. "This place speaks louder than I ever could." She nodded once, then turned to her team. "Let's get to work." For the next 5 hours, the neighborhood transformed into a federal investigation site. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning topography and soil displacement patterns. Ground-penetrating radar units mapped the underlying clay strata. 2 technicians took core samples, carefully labeling them before sliding them into cooled containers. Others reviewed the trail cam footage I'd provided and matched it against excavation logs. What struck me most wasn't their precision, it was their speed. They didn't waste time on hypotheticals. They moved like surgeons who already knew where the infection was, only needing to confirm the depth. By noon, a cordon had been placed around the collapsed sections. Orange flags, red tape, and laminated hazard notices warned residents to stay clear. Doug's old sand piles used to beautify the tennis court and rec area were sampled and tagged as contaminated fill. The new management firm already assigned to replace the dissolved HOA board was ordered to cease all site activity pending results of the investigation. Then came the interviews. Erica conducted them herself, concise, respectful, but unyielding. She interviewed Shelley first. I didn't witness it directly, but I watched from a distance as Shelley sat on her front porch, shoulders hunched, clutching a wrinkled binder. She answered every question with a tight, trembling voice. When Erica showed her the footage of Doug's illegal dredging, Shelley reportedly went pale and whispered, "I thought he had permits." Whether she actually believed that or not didn't matter anymore. Ignorance wasn't a defense. Then they came to me. We sat in my kitchen, the window behind us, framing the river's scarred edge, like a wound that refused to close. "Walk us through it," Erica said, voice low and clinical. "From the beginning." I did. Every detail. Every warning I gave. Every response or lack thereof from the board. I showed her the photos, the emails, the terrain logs. When I handed her the annotated map of the pre-dredge river curvature overlaid with post-collapse erosion vectors, she actually smiled. "Mr. Reed," she said, tapping the paper, "you just built our case for us." "It wasn't for you," I replied. "It was for this place." She nodded once. No patronizing platitudes, just professional respect. I appreciated that more than any thank you. Over the next week, federal agents returned daily. They cataloged every section of riverbank affected. They interviewed over 24 residents, some furious, some devastated, some simply confused. Every home bordering the river was re-evaluated for stability. Several were declared unsafe pending remediation. And then the storm broke again. Not from the clouds, but from the federal announcement. On the 12th day after the collapse, the EPA held a press conference at Bonner City Hall. Erica stood at the podium flanked by state officials and the mayor. Her words were measured. Clear. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association is under federal investigation for multiple violations of the Clean Water Act, including unauthorized dredging, illegal fill usage, and destruction of protected riparian habitat. Preliminary findings show that these actions directly contributed to the collapse of the riverbank and the subsequent property loss. She paused, looked out over the room packed with cameras and reporters. We have identified gross negligence, willful misrepresentation, and failures in leadership that led to an avoidable environmental disaster. And then the bombshell. We are recommending civil penalties, criminal referrals, and a federally mandated environmental remediation order. Furthermore, we will support residents in seeking restitution. The room exploded. Flashbulbs, shouted questions, gasps. In the back row, I sat silently. No joy, no triumph, just a quiet exhale. The kind that comes after months of being dismissed, mocked, and threatened when the truth finally lands like a gavel. The next day, a federal lien was placed on all HOA-owned assets. The clubhouse, the rec center, the tennis courts, everything. HOA accounts were frozen. Any remaining board members resigned en masse. Shelley's house went up for sale within 48 hours. Doug's contractor's license was revoked. And I was offered a job. Well, technically a contract. The EPA wanted me to serve as an independent liaison for the riverbank remediation effort. Erica called it an act of community integrity that deserved to be part of the solution. The restoration would take years. Native flora would be replanted. The river's natural curves reestablished. Erosion control grids installed. The clay shelf reinforced using geocell technology. And I would help oversee it. I said yes, but not because I needed a job. Because I needed to finish what they started. Not the HOA, the river. That winding, relentless force that had once whispered me awake and lulled me to sleep. The river didn't need revenge. It needed respect. And now, for the first time in a long while, it was finally being heard. Erica and I stood at the river's edge later that week, just after the final soil survey. She looked at the muddy slope, then at me. What kept you going? I thought for a moment. Then I said I listened. When they paved over the truth, I kept listening. The land tells you everything if you don't drown it out with arrogance. She nodded slowly. You should write that down. I smiled. I just did. We stood in silence for a long while. The river moved beside us, not fast, not loud, but steady, as it always had. Justice doesn't come like thunder. It arrives in papers, forms, clauses, court orders. It arrives in slow-moving trucks carrying erosion mesh and bundles of willow cuttings. It arrives in orange-vested crews who don't talk much, who carry survey poles, and call the river by its official number instead of its name. But for me, justice came the morning I saw the first saplings planted. I stood on the edge of what used to be Lot 46 Wilk's backyard, now a designated restoration zone, as two state workers drove steel stakes into the slope. Between them, they unrolled geotextile fabric, weaving it along the contour line. Behind them, a crew from the Wise California Riparian Alliance unloaded bundles of red and sandbar willow, the same varieties I'd fought to protect months ago. The irony wasn't lost on me now the government was paying to replant what the HOA had ripped out, and I'd been asked to help supervise it all. As part of the Federal Recovery Initiative, they'd appointed me as a technical community liaison. It wasn't a glamorous title, but it meant something. It meant my voice now sat in the same meetings where I'd once been dismissed. It meant the river finally had an advocate who didn't carry a clipboard to count fines, but one who understood it. Our first formal reconstruction meeting was held not in the collapsed clubhouse, but under a canvas tent by the floodplain. The ground was too unstable for structures yet, but the symbolism was clear. We were starting fresh, literally from the soil up. The room, or rather the clearing, was filled with professionals, civil engineers, ecologists, city planners, and me, the homeowner who wouldn't shut up. Some of them had read about me in the news. Others only knew me as the retired scientist with the dirt maps. I didn't care what they thought as long as they listened. I presented my findings again, not out of habit, but because it still mattered. I pointed out the zones of ongoing undercutting. I proposed contour lines for stepped terracing, suggested specific willow spacing for bank reinforcement, even recommended my old USGS contact for LiDAR scans before the next rain season. No one rolled their eyes. No one cut me off. One young hydrologist, a woman named Priya, scribbled notes furiously as I spoke. After the meeting, she caught up with me and said, "You should have been in charge from the start." I gave her a half smile. I was trying to be. They just didn't know they were listening to the right guy. By then, the neighborhood had changed. With the HOA effectively dismantled, the management firm had shifted into transparency mode. Meetings were now public and documented. The old bylaws were under legal review. Residents were offered a choice: keep the HOA structure with new safeguards or dissolve it entirely. The vote wasn't even close. 79% opted to disband it permanently. Gone were the power-tripping letters about mailbox color. Gone were the backyard inspections and $50 fines for unauthorized garden beds. The red vests had vanished. In their place, neighbors helping each other move sandbags, raising funds for affected families, and planting trees together along the newly named Willow Trail. And as for Shelley, she pled no contest to misdemeanor environmental negligence. The feds didn't pursue felony charges, partly because she cooperated once the collapse occurred, and partly because she was in the end a pawn. But she was fined $42,000, banned from serving on any homeowner's board in California, and lost her real estate license for failure to disclose known environmental risks during a prior home sale. Doug Pearson wasn't so lucky. With the weight of my footage, the EPA's findings, and the large state contractor licensing board's internal audit, he was fined $120,000 and barred from holding a contractor's license for life. He vanished from the region entirely. Someone said he was working under a fake name somewhere near Yuma, laying gravel for trailer parks. The Daniels family rebuilt this time 10 feet further from the slope with a brand new deck and a reinforced steel footer. I helped design the slope grading behind their house. Mira brought me lemon muffins every week for 3 months. The Mendozas opted to sell. I didn't blame them. But before they left, Mr. Mendoza walked down to the river with me one last time. He looked out over the curve where his backyard used to be and said, "You were the only one who fought for the land. I hope it remembers you." I didn't know how to answer, so I just nodded. And my house, it stood strong. The old sycamore near the ridge had survived the worst of it, roots still hugging the earth like the river never dared to take them. I installed a new rain catchment system, replanted the native grass, and built a small bench overlooking the water. Sometimes in the early morning, I'd sit there with a thermos of coffee and let the mist roll up over my boots. The river had scars now, same as I did, but it still moved with purpose. One evening, I received a letter from a stranger. It came in a pale blue envelope with no return address, only a stamp from Sacramento. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You were right to fight. I didn't understand the cost of not listening. I do now. Thank you. SV." I folded it neatly and placed it in the back of the same file box that once held my mountain of receipts. I didn't need it anymore, but it belonged with the story. The story of a river that warned us. The story of a man they called dramatic until the ground proved him right. The story of a neighborhood rebuilt not by force or fines or flyers, but by truth. And by the people who finally stopped talking over the land and started listening. The first time I walked the new trail, I didn't recognize it. Where the old river path had once been a sterile stretch of HOA-mandated gravel and ornamental lights, there now stood native grasses swaying in the morning breeze, wild yarrow bursting with yellow, and a line of red-stemmed dogwood tracing the edge of the restored slope. The river, too, looked different. Not tamed, not rigid, but respected. It moved naturally again, meandering with purpose through the cradle of its new banks, as if reclaiming its memory. The signs had gone up that week. Redding River Ecological Corridor. Rehabilitated with community and state partnership. Restoration ongoing. And beside them, smaller plaques. In memory of what was lost. In honor of what was saved. I paused beside one near the old clubhouse site, now an open meadow with seating stones and a simple pavilion. The wind rolled off the water cool and clean, carrying none of the bitterness that had once lingered here. No more shouts from board meetings, no more barking orders over fences, no more threats printed on paper with smiling logos. It was quiet again, not empty, peaceful, the way it was always meant to be. Behind me, a small group of children from the elementary school had gathered for a field trip. Their teacher, a woman in a wide sun hat and hiking boots, pointed toward the slope and explained erosion plains and the importance of native plants. One boy raised his hand and asked if this was the river that fell apart. The teacher smiled. "No," she said, "this is the river that came back together." I felt something tighten in my chest. I kept walking. These days, I don't get stopped at the grocery store as much anymore. The headlines have faded. The lawsuits were settled. Most of the families who stayed have adapted stronger, more cautious, and far more united. Without the HOA acting as a middleman for every blade of grass, neighbors started actually knowing one another. They borrow tools now. Share garden cuttings. There's a Saturday pancake breakfast hosted on a rotating lawn. The guy who used to argue about hedge height now brings extra chairs to community potlucks. Funny what happens when fear isn't institutionalized. The final restoration report from the EPA was mailed out last week. I read it while sitting on the bench I built with my own hands, the same one that overlooks the river bend. The language was clinical, but in its own way, it was beautiful. Page after page of charts and soil tests confirming that sediment levels had stabilized, that native flora had taken hold, that the aquatic ecosystem had rebounded beyond expectation. At the end, there was a paragraph titled Community Impact. One sentence stood out. The restoration of the lower Reading riverbank demonstrates the power of early warning community resistance to institutional negligence and the importance of lived expertise in ecological resilience. I closed the folder and stared out at the water. That was the long way of saying, they finally listened. Shelley moved away. I never heard from her again after the anonymous letter. I don't wish her ill. I hope she found a smaller world to control, maybe one that doesn't break so easily. Doug, last I heard, was trying to rebuild his license in another state. He won't find the soil any more forgiving out there. Some people learn by collapse, others never do. But me, I've changed too. I'm not the same quiet retiree who just wanted to walk barefoot by the river. I still do that, sure, but now I carry a different kind of presence. One earned not through title or noise, but through endurance. I didn't win a war. I didn't defeat a monster. I just refused to be ignored. And the land, I think, respects that. Some mornings, I hear owls again. The willows I helped replant are taller now, young but certain of themselves. Deer prints return to the mud after rain. The river holds its shape steady, no longer rushing to punish, no longer grasping for stolen earth. It flows because that's what it was always meant to do. At the far edge of the path, near the widest curve, there's a wooden bridge, newly installed, simple, sturdy, built by volunteers and engineers together. On its side is a small brass plate with 6 words, "Let the land speak for itself." That was something I'd once said at the hearing, maybe without even realizing it would be remembered. But someone wrote it down, and now it speaks louder than I ever could. In the end, this wasn't just a fight over dirt or bylaws. It was about listening. To science, to warnings, to nature, and sometimes to the quiet guy next door with muddy boots and a head full of maps. So if you ever walk that trail and hear the river hum, know this. It's not just water running over stone. It's a story. One of arrogance, collapse, resistance, and healing. A story we almost buried until the land told it for us. And I was there to hear every word.